Kitco News special coverage of the 31st Global Metals and Mining Conference is brought to you by Gold Terra.
Hello, I'm Michelle Makori and welcome back to Kitco's coverage of the Bank of Montreal Global Metals and Mining Conference here in Hollywood, Florida, now in its 31st year. And joining me now is Keith Neumeyer. Keith is the CEO and founder of First Majestic Silver and the chairman of First Mining Gold Corp. Good to have you with us, Keith.
Great seeing you again, Michelle.
All right, Keith, let's dive right into it. And I want to start off with a big overview of the macro situation. Of course, we have the Russia invasion of Ukraine dominating headlines around the globe and also the markets. Very fast developing story, but as it stands, we have the US and its allies really tightening the squeeze economically on Russia, which is also forcing Putin to take more aggressive military actions as he's seeing more resistance from Ukraine than anticipated. Do you think there's a diplomatic solution to this? Do you think that this continues to escalate on a military front? How do you think this plays out?
Well, you know, I thought there was going to be Crimea all over again. I wasn't surprised to see Russia move into the eastern regions of the Ukraine and take over the Donbass region and other predominantly Russian parts of the Ukraine. But I was very surprised to see him move into the Ukraine itself and now approaching Kiev, which I think is a major mistake on his part. And of course, the international community has now stood up and acting, you know, against Russia, which is very unfortunate for the globe. You know.
Well, it's certainly very uncertain how this plays out and develops, both from a military perspective and from an economic perspective. But so far, as cynical as it sounds, we have seen that this has been a relatively positive environment for silver. What does this mean for silver if this war continues to drag on, at least for the next couple of weeks?
Yeah, you know, look, it's the supply-demand fundamentals of the silver is so good. I don't think we need a war to move silver prices. And I predicted, you know, $30 silver this year before this even happened. So I still think that's going to happen. But it's unfortunate we're seeing metal prices move as a result of this event in Europe. But it's going to cause huge supply chain problems going forward, in my opinion.
All right, but let's focus on the angle of first and foremost inflation and the Fed and what that could mean in terms of your expectations for the next Fed meeting and that impact on silver prices.
Well, inflation is there, and it's going to get worse. You know, whether it's grains, whether it's oil, whether it's metals, you know, a variety of different commodities. Russia is a big supplier of multiple commodities to the world. I think Russia supplies 30% of energy to the planet, predominantly Europe, and you know, to cut Europe off is going to be devastating for those economies. So, you know, it's going to cause more supply chain disruptions and higher prices all across the board.
And as we noted, inflation is at a 4-decade high. But if we have this geopolitical risk, it really impedes the Fed's ability to take any kind of action, although many would argue that any action from the Fed wouldn't be that relevant anyway, considering where we are. But how has silver traditionally done in a high inflation environment? Has it been a successful hedge against inflation, and are investors likely to see it that way?
Well, first off, to your first point about interest rates and the Fed, you know, I think consensus has been that there's going to be a 0.5 point increase in March, and that was right up until I think the invasion. I've seen the numbers now come out at a 0.25 point, and even now I'm listening to people say there's going to be zero action, you know, from the Fed. It's hard to say, but I would not be surprised for the Fed to, you know, blame this war for making no action at all, and that's going to be very, very positive for gold. I wouldn't be surprised to see gold gap up $100 at the end of March when this all happens.
And as it typically does, take silver up with it.
Oh, for sure, absolutely.
All right. Well, not to sound cynical, but if this does escalate into a more severe military situation from an industrial level that impacts silver in a number of ways, first and foremost, war is good for silver. As cynical and as deranged as that sounds, correct me if I'm wrong, but a number of weapons, including Tomahawk missiles, use a lot of silver. We were chatting about this earlier, and about 500 ounces of silver goes into each Tomahawk missile. So what is the industrial case for silver in a war climate?
First off, what a waste of silver. Having that silver spread all over the place is a terrible use. I'd rather that silver go into, the green energy, the green movement, and electrifying the planet in ways that we're trying to accomplish. But it is, you're right, used in a variety of military weapons and tools. From navigation systems to weapons, and it's just one more use of the metal. We're seeing solar panels, we're seeing electric cars, now we're seeing military weaponry.
On the flip side of that is the industrial use of silver may decline if we do see a global recession as a result of this conflict, if it doesn't spiral into a military escalation any more than it has, or even if it does. Certainly there's going to be an economic impact from these sanctions. And one could assume that that would lead to an economic slowdown. We were already sort of toying with the possibility of a recession prior to this. What would that mean in terms of traditional silver demand on the industrial use case for everything from cars to fridges to electric appliances? Do you see that hampering that demand?
Well, hopefully this stays regional. God forbid this gets more broad, throughout Europe and elsewhere around the planet. But, if it stays regional, I think, still the demand is there for solar panels. I've seen numbers as high as 140 million ounces of demand in the solar industry. We're likely going to approach 100 million ounces of demand in the automotive sector this year. These industries are moving fast to electrify the planet and get fuel combustion cars off the surface of the earth. So I don't think that's going to stop unless this war really escalates out of control.
On one of the fundamentals driving silver, solar panels is this move to clean energy. You just referenced solar panels.
Mm-hmm.
One of the issues that has come up, that has been highlighted, is, of course, the major dependence of oil and gas. And many are seeing this as a wake-up call to those that have been advocating to reduce oil and gas and fossil fueled energy, saying that perhaps this has been too aggressive a move. And it's time to scale it back a little bit, to slow down the move away from fossil fuels, and that perhaps that pushes the targets for going green a little further off on the horizon, that the restrictions on oil and gas may be loosened in response to this. Mm-hmm. Does that have a near-term impact on the price of silver?
Well, it's hard to say. I think that you're right. I think that thesis is coming out more, among the experts, that the new Green Deal and, going green is not going to be as easy or quick as some politicians would like it to be. Getting off oil and gas, it's a great goal, but it's not going to take 10 years or less. This is a 50-year process to change the electrical grid on the planet. And that's going to take a lot of silver and a lot of copper and a lot of other metals to accomplish that. And I think the politicians are being unrealistic. And I think this war, it's very energy intensive. And I think, countries around the world, I wouldn't be surprised to see Germany, for example, turn on their nuclear plants again. We're already seeing talks in Japan about them turning on the nuclear plants. So politicians are waking up to the fact that some of their objectives or goals are unrealistic.
But it doesn't change the long-term trajectory, which is positive for silver.
Or even short-term. I think that because the demand is so great, the amount of ounces we need is so great. Like, we're producing 800 million ounces a year as a mining sector. And you said yourself that we're consuming this year 1.1 billion ounces. That's a 300 million ounce deficit. Where's that silver going to come from? How long can you have these deficits before there's just simply no silver left?
Well, let's break down that number, because that was according to the Silver Institute forecasting a record demand for silver this year, setting a record at 1.112 billion ounces. That's beating last year, which was also a record at 1.02 billion ounces. So that was before we had the situation in Ukraine. Do you think that is going to change, that there's going to be a higher demand than what we're seeing? Or what was forecast rather by the
again, if you said yourself, a cruise missile needs, 15 kilos of silver or 500 ounces of silver, hopefully they don't have to build many more cruise missiles. But, I think there's not enough silver around anyways to supply the auto industry and supply the solar panel industry or the electronic manufacturing industry. So we know the deficits exist, whether there's a war or not. I don't think that changes anything.
Now, we touched previously on, of course, the greenification of the energy grid, and President Biden still has a goal of 100% clean electricity by 2035. 100% clean electricity 2035 and zero emissions by 2050. How realistic is that in terms of where the silver supply is?
It's not practical. I quite honestly, I don't think we'll ever get off oil and gas. We'll use less of it, no doubt about that. But it's going to take time. Do you have an electric car?
No.
No, and I do not either. And I think I only have one or two friends that have electric cars. So that industry is just starting. How many years is it going to take before all of us have electric vehicles? Another 10 years. I have no plan to buy an electric car anytime soon. So at least 20 years before we replace the above ground fleet. There's 1.4 billion cars sitting on the surface of the earth right now. And the auto industry is producing 95 million a year. So at that rate, that in itself is 15 years. That's assuming every car produced from today forward is electric, which is not going to happen.
So a bit out of touch there with the gold, but help me understand the disparity between the projected demand for silver and the projected supply.
Well, your number that you threw out earlier about the 1.1 billion that the Silver Institute has estimated for 2022.
Yeah.
I've heard numbers as high as 1.4 billion for 2022. So, whatever the number is, it's more than we're producing. So these ounces are coming from somewhere. There's a limited amount of silver sitting on the surface in investment hoards. Once that's gone, there's no place to get the silver. So one thing has to happen. Silver prices have to go up. So how long is it going to take for the mining sector to react? It's a decade, 10 to 15 years to get a mine into production from the day that the management teams decide to bring a mine into production.
And yet, even though we've had a slight spike over the last couple of days, this is not reflected in the price of silver. You are, of course, the man that originated the term triple-digit silver. Mm-hmm. It has gained traction with other people subsequently. But when is that going to happen? Why are we not seeing this notion, which is rooted in some very solid fundamentals, translate into the price of silver?
That's a very good question. And, look, I'm not a conspiracy theorist at all, but I am a trader. I came from the banking sector. I know trading. I see the way markets work. And, when you see silver and gold prices fluctuate the way they did last Thursday, that was option expiry date. So obviously there must have been a lot of people on the wrong side of that trade who drove down the gold prices and the silver prices that day. I think gold had a $100 trading range that day and silver had a $2 trading range that day. That's not natural markets. Markets don't act like that unless there's someone involved in moving those prices. And unfortunately, as long as that is allowed to continue to happen, I've been voicing this concern for a number of years now. The regulators don't come to the and look at what's really going on in these paper markets, because unfortunately, as a mining sector, we have to rely on the paper market for pricing our commodity.
Right.
If somehow we can get away from the paper market and price our market based on actual supply and demand, where we can actually deal with the end user directly, whether it's a Sony or Panasonic or a Tesla or BMW, you name the consumer. I think that's where we need to go, and that's where we get proper pricing, and that's what I'm pushing.
And we have touched on this before, that there isn't enough physical silver to back up the paper silver out there, that the futures markets may distort things.
Yeah.
So how does that get fixed?
By the mining sector standing up and saying we've had enough. When the silver market trades approximately 1 billion ounces a day in the paper market, and the miners produce 800 million ounces in a year. So the leverage is astronomical. So as long as the regulators stand by and do nothing about that, and I don't expect they ever will, because generally speaking, the banks are pretty powerful out there. Who's going to stand up to that? It's got to be the miners. The miners have to get together, like OPEC, like the diamond industry, like the uranium industry. Why does silver and gold have to be treated differently as other commodities?
So is that something you would potentially do? Lead some kind of silver consortium to fight against this?
I've been vocal about it a number of times, and I'm on record today on Kitco and in this interview today. So I challenge the mining sector to come to the table and let's create a new system.
Is that something that you would like to be at the forefront of? How
Absolutely.
How realistic is it to get all the?
First Majestic is small. Like, we produce 13 million ounces of silver a year. So we're big in the sector, but you've got a lot of the base metal manufacturers, the copper manufacturers, the zinc manufacturers who produce multiples of that. But the silver is a small component of their overall financial system or statements, because they're predominantly copper producers or whatever the case may be. So they actually really don't care too much about silver because it's just a small line item. That's a small part of their business.
But have you had these conversations with bigger players? You're at a conference like this, for example. Mm-hmm. First time in a long time that everybody's in person, but this has been a lingering issue. You're at a conference like this. There are a number of titans of industry in attendance. Is this a conversation you guys are having on the sidelines privately, that it's time to form some kind of consortium?
I try my best. I brought it up a number of times with players in the industry, and I think it's a lot of work to do, and it is a lot of work. When you and the mining sector is very comfortable. And it's we produce our metal. The banks consume it, and it goes into industry, and we get paid. It's very simple, and the mining industry, as I said, is just too comfortable. If the mining industry would actually stand up and break the system, yes, it's going to take a lot of work. And yes, there will be challenges to do it. But I think, for our shareholders and investors, I think it's our duty to create a new system of pricing.
Create a new system of pricing, something that you think is long overdue. In the meantime, though, given the dynamics are what they are, what is your price outlook for silver for 2022?
Well, quite honestly, you kind of touched on a little bit earlier, but, we're mining 7 to 1. So what I mean by that is for every 1 ounce of gold we mine worldwide, we mine 7 ounces of silver. So, but we're trading at something in the order of 75 to 1. So we traded at 7 to 1 today at approximately $2,000 gold. It's at, $150 silver approximately. That's where we should be today. So we're not, obviously, but, I'm not going to predict $150, today. I am a triple digit silver guy, but I've dealt with it'll happen in 2022, but hopefully it happens in my lifetime.
But do you have a number that you care to throw out there for 2022?
Let's call it $30.
$30 silver. Yeah. Not quite triple digit, not anywhere near triple digit, no. But your life is still long.
Yeah.
So still very likely in your lifetime, Keith.
Yeah.
Want to touch on First Majestic very quickly because your company's financials have shown that your top line revenue has grown quite dramatically. Q4 results aren't out yet, but Q3 2021 top line revenue was at 380 million. Overall, you've had significant top line growth, but that hasn't been reflected in the share price. Mm-hmm. Why not?
I think there's just been so much money flowing into the major markets that the entire mining sector has been ignored. It is a small market. You compare the mining sector to, the high technology sector, for example. I don't know how many First Majestics can fit inside Apple, but it would be a lot. Apple.
But you need First Majestics to make the silver that goes into the Apple phones.
That is true, and that's why we get so ignored for whatever reason. And I've said, we've seen Elon Musk, invest in nickel or also lithium. I wouldn't be surprised to see the technology sector start buying up mines because why not own the entire supply chain? If you are producing iPads, you're at the mercy of the miners and you need the supply. But in a constrained environment where the metal's not there, you need to own a mine to close the supply chain.
That is a very interesting strategy play. Is that something that you're thinking is likely for smaller silver miners and other metals and commodities miners to be bought up by these giant tech companies?
You've seen the movie iRobot.
I have not.
You have not? Okay. Or Terminator.
Terminator.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, in these types of, sci-fi movies, there's always one or two conglomerates that basically run the planet. And we're not that far away from that. Look at this. How many $1 trillion companies do we have today? 10 years ago we had 0. I think today we have about 5, at least last I looked. So, these companies are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they're wiping out the competition. And that trend is going to continue. So what does that mean, 10, 20, 30 years from now? These big conglomerates are going to own more and more of the supply chain. So yeah, for them to move down and start buying up the miners, for me as the CEO of First Majestic, I want to own the entire supply chain. I want to own the refinery. I want to own the smelter. I want to own the mint, because that way my margins increase. So why wouldn't a high technology, an Apple of the world, want to, not do the same thing?
Well, it makes sense. It's disconcerting because you don't want to have so much consolidated power and control.
Sure. Yeah.
But it makes sense that you'd have these giant tech companies buy up the supply chain. Has that happened so far in the metals industry at all?
Well, we've seen with Tesla, they've invested in nickel and lithium so far. They're the only ones that have done it, as far as I know. But yes, I think it's the beginning for sure.
So that's the trend you're forecasting: big tech acquiring some of the, at first, smaller miners?
I don't necessarily know about smaller miners, but strategic metals. And I look at silver as a strategic metal. I'm not sure if a mining or a high-tech company like an Apple, for example, needs to own a gold mine because they use such a small amount of gold. But silver is a different thing. Copper, nickel, these are strategic metals that they need to invest or develop and expand their businesses. So yes, I could absolutely see it there.
Well, that has certainly given us a great topic for our next conversation. Appreciate you joining us today, Keith. Thank you so much.
Well, it's very nice seeing you again, Michelle.
Likewise. Thank you, Keith.
Thanks.
Kitco News special coverage of the 31st Global Metals and Mining Conference is brought to you by Gold Terra,